Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we continue working on our Phasmophobia cross-minute mashup. And last time we were finally able to create a proper vision cone for the camera item in our game. It was an extensive sequence of failures, with the final idea being the most simple of them all. However, figuring things out allowed us to not only make the vision cones more dynamic in their usage, but also allow us to add video cameras to the game's list of usable items, which served as stationary versions of the player's camera. All in all, a struggle, but one that provided us with a great deal of progress. Progress we continue building on with today's plan. We'll be adding to the vision cone code in order to expand the number of things that we can photograph. This includes the bone and voodoo doll items, which will also be added to the game. And finally, we'll start testing ghost-related interactables with the addition of the salt item. Sounds like a plan, so let's get to the coding. First, we needed a new object for the bone and voodoo dolls. Their behaviors are so unique that it felt like the best way to handle them. This would also allow me to tie them to a new parent object specifically meant for objects that can be photographed. This would include the ghost. It also meant that the vision code needed to be amended to check for the parent instead of just the ghost. New variables were then added to keep track of whether these items had been photographed. Next, in the item behavior code, it was time to finally capture some pictures, in data form at least. And I'll just summarize the next 40 plus minutes, which consisted of two main issues. The first was, well, for some reason I completely forgot that the place meeting function doesn't return an object ID. Instance place does. The second issue was a little more complicated. We had to figure out which child object was being returned based on their ID, which I thought was possible with a simple built-in function. After many failed attempts, I discovered that it was possible, but requires defining the index beforehand. So I figured if the index had to be defined anyway, that I would instead use my own custom index variable instead. A third issue also popped up that was a result of the tool sequencer negating the photograph code, which is also added to the headache of everything else. But eventually the code was in a place that everything was working properly. We were now able to identify the children objects of the photograph parent based on their index variables. And quote-unquote taking a photo would switch the corresponding boolean to true, meaning a photograph of that particular object was, in fact, photographed. And to celebrate and cap off this strenuous endeavor, the ability to kick around the bone and voodoo doll were added. This was done mostly for fun, but will also play into the game later on. For now, the camera was finally in a finished enough state that we could move on. And that meant up next was the salt. New salt-related variables are added to the ghost, then a collision check for the salt was made in the step event. In the event, the ghost salt counter would be set and a timer would initiate. Then, as long as the ghost was moving, the salt timer would run and footprints would be added each time the timer hit 0. This would repeat based on the salt counter value. And instead of creating yet another surface, I simply decided to pull the footsteps as part of a general evidence object. And for now, the evidence object would consist of salty footprints and fingerprints, which we'll be adding in a future episode. And I won't lie, I spent a ton of time tweaking the footprint sprite to make them more obvious, but still subtle enough that the player has to be observant. It was an interesting challenge due to the monochrome style, which made it difficult to find the right visual balance. I think the end result was pretty good, but we'll have to wait and see how they stack up to a room more populated with actual stuff. And sadly, that was all the time I had for this session. Generally speaking, I'm pretty satisfied with a lot of how this project has turned out so far, though the abundance of things to keep track of is getting kinda crazy. Regardless, I'm still excited to keep trucking along as we still have a ton of interesting stuff left to add and reimagine, mostly when it comes to the ghost's behavior. But indeed, I spent so much time struggling / polishing this episode that we've sadly reached the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.